Okay. The earliest surviving images of Jesus come from the eastern corner of the Roman Empire, from the Syrian city of Dura Europos, where a house church dated from between 233 and 256 CE was brought to light and combined French and American excavations of the late 1920s and 30s. Here, along with a representation of Jesus symbolically as the Good Shepherd, there are two preserved pictures from the life of Jesus. In the first, Jesus walks on water, and Peter is with him, as he is in Matthew 14, 22 to 34. In the second, Jesus heals the paralytic, who takes up his bed and walks, an incident also found in Matthew 1 to 8. While the images are not well preserved, Jesus clearly wears the usual mantle over a short tunic, and he has short hair. He might have a slight beard in the walking on the water scene. There he is down in the bottom right-hand corner. But it is very indistinct. He's not taller than the figure of Peter or the paralytic. He's recognizable by his actions, healing, walking on water, not by his appearance. While we ourselves have a mental image about what Jesus looked like, thanks to the dominant cultural tradition of how he should be represented, with long hair and a beard, dressed in long robes with long baggy sleeves, often coloured white or blue, this comfortable convention was not available to those who used the Gospels in the 1st to 3rd centuries. Indeed, the reverse was true. The Gospel writers appear to avoid any description that would allow readers or hearers to visualize Jesus. In the opening to the Gospel of John, we learn that the Word was made flesh and tabernacled among us, but this does not immediately conjure up an image of a specific person who could be described in terms of height, facial features, handsomeness, beardedness, clothing, or whatever. The verse goes on, and we looked at his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. It is as if the Gospel sidesteps the issue of what the flesh of Jesus was, as if it was just cladding, or the tent for his glory to inhabit. The important thing is his divine inner being. We are invited to think of the flesh as Jesus' crucial human form, but nowhere is this described. And it is a curiously unstable category in the Gospel. After all, we are told, do not judge by appearances, but judge by right judgment in John 7:24. When Mary encounters the risen Jesus outside the tomb, she doesn't recognize him in John 20:40. While the other disciples proclaim they have seen the risen Lord, Thomas is the only one to be unconvinced, and he will not until he sees his injuries, to which Jesus states, "Is it because you have seen me you believe? Blessed are they who did not see me and yet believe." To make them even more blessed, it seems, the Gospel does absolutely nothing to help anyone see Jesus. The failure of disciples to recognize the risen Christ plays out also in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 24, where two disciples of Jesus, presumably familiar with the appearance of their master, talk to him on the road to Emmaus without realizing who he is. And in Mark 16:12, the extra ending, it's stated quite boldly that the resurrected Jesus appeared in another form, but we are not told what the original form of his body was. We find the same strategy throughout the New Testament. In the letter to the Hebrews, Jesus is made flesh because the children of God share in flesh and blood. He himself participated in the same in Hebrews 2:14. There is even a powerful statement or memory of the historical Jesus in this letter, that in the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and who was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, in Hebrews 5:7-8. Here we see the anguished Jesus praying and pleading. We have explicit mention of Jesus' tears, but we do not learn of the fleshly face those tears ran down. In the Gospels, Jesus walks, talks, heals, touches, drinks, eats, gets seized, spat on, beaten, whipped and crucified, but we do not have him visually described. The title of this talk, The Reception of the Image of Jesus Before Constantine, starts with nothing. There is no literary attestation from the 1st or early 2nd centuries when people who knew Jesus, or people who knew Jesus, were still alive. There was no memory, apparently, of the appearance of Jesus recorded, at least as far as our extent literary sources tell us. There is not only nothing in the canonical Gospels, there is nothing in the extra-canonical Gospels. We do not get to descriptions of the physical appearance of Jesus until the Veronica and Abgar legends of the 7th century and beyond, or the spurious letter of Lentulus. One may well conclude that the image of Jesus we find first in representational art of the 3rd century is invented. As to why Jesus is not depicted, Maurice Casey offers a reasonable explanation, noting that, of course, some people in Galilee will have remembered what Jesus looked like, and so would his brother James and the inner group of 3 apostles, but the authors of the Gospels did not see him. To tell us what he looked like, they would have needed someone to tell them, and they would have needed to be interested enough to tell us. This is where the genre of the Gospels is important at 2 levels. Firstly, they fall within the broad parameters of ancient lives, which were not always interested in people's appearance either. Not always. Secondly, they are Gospels. What does Jesus' appearance have to do with, for example, the validity of Jesus' atoning death or salvation for Gentiles? Nothing. These 2 points explain why the Gospels do not describe Jesus' appearance. However, Casey's defense of why there is no mention of the appearance of Jesus is not entirely satisfactory. If the Gospels are to be understood as falling in the genre category of Greco-Roman biography, as David Orno and Richard Burridge have persuasively argued, we do find a number of cases in which physical appearance of the subject is of crucial interest. As Elizabeth Evans noted, a regular feature of the schemata used by Suetonius and De Vita Caesarum, by the writers of the Historia Augusta, and by, later, Ammianus Marcellinus, is the description of personal appearance. In terms of great kings and rulers, a handsome physical appearance informs an assessment of their innate leadership qualities. In Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Darius III is the tallest and most handsome of all men. In Suetonius' Life of Augustus 79, we learn of Augustus. His teeth were wide apart, small and well kept. His hair was slightly curly and inclining to golden. His eyebrows met. His ears were of a moderate size, and his nose projected a little at the top and then bent slightly inward. Very detailed description of a nose. His complexion was between dark and fair. He was short of stature. Additionally, people had the image of the young, always the young, Augustus in every city of the empire. Strong, a good-looking face that everyone could recognize. The Seleucid ruler Demetrius Poliorcetes is recognizably a king because of his handsome appearance, as well as his royal garb in Diodorus Siculus 20. Another Demetrius, son of Euthydemus, is recognized by Antiochus III as being of royal rank, partly because he's very handsome in Polybius 11. Strabo describes Darius I as the most handsome of men, except for his having very long arms in Geographia 15. Like Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic king should be strikingly handsome and beardless, patterned on youthful Greek gods and heroes. So in his biography of Moses, Philo duly writes that the child Moses, as soon as he was born, displayed a more beautiful and novel form than usual. Vita Moses 1:9. And when the king's daughter saw that he was more perfect than could have been expected at his age, and when from his appearance she conceived greater goodwill than ever towards him, she adopted him as her son, in Moses 1:19. Likewise, Josephus presents Moses' beauty as a baby as the reason that Pharaoh's daughter Thamusis wanted the infant, because God had taken such great care in the formation of Moses. And you get that image of the beautiful Moses continued in later Christian art, for example, in San Vitale in Ravenna. The portrayal of Moses as handsome correlates with widespread expectations that a royal ruler should be good looking. However, in the case of Moses, there is scriptural basis. In the story of Exodus, of course, Moses is indeed a gorgeous baby. Moses' mother saw that he was beautiful, told in Exodus 2:2. And this motif of good looks continues on in terms of Joseph, of Saul. You can look through many parts of the Old Testament in which the motif of good looks accompanies being a king. And of course, David is the prime example. David walks in front of Samuel, and it's noted that David is ruddy with lovely eyes and a handsome appearance in 1 Samuel 16:12. Even though it's said that God doesn't judge just by appearances, he judges what's in the heart. When it comes down to it, David just happens to be extremely good looking as well. His son, Absalom is also a stunner. In all of Israel, there was no one as handsome as Absalom, and so on and so on. Given this, it would have been so easy in terms of emphasizing that Jesus came from the line of David if someone had noted that he was very good looking. In terms of defining him as a great prophet like Moses, it would have been the clincher. As it is written, he was beautiful, was a sentence surely waiting to be used in terms of the Matthew-Moses typology. Even at the least, as one having the Spirit of God, Philo, for one, would have expected him to be good-looking, as he says of Abraham. For the divine Spirit which was breathed upon him from on high made its lodging in his soul and invested his body with a singular beauty. If there were a memory of Jesus being good-looking then, it is quite remarkable that it is not mentioned. So let us go now to the question of physiognomy. The absence of a physical description of Jesus is even stranger when we consider how much store was set on appearance in the Greco-Roman world, given the prevalence of the study of physiognomy. This refers to a method of understanding the personality of someone by interpreting their bodily features. Such a method was not some marginal mumbo-jumbo, but understood as proper science by philosophers, with a treatise purportedly written by Aristotle to inform judgments, and a definitive compendium of law produced by Polemon in the 2nd century. Every part of the body was indicative of the personality, though especially the face. This underpins, in fact, the descriptions of people in biographies of the classical world, and explains why kings are described meticulously in terms of their physical appearance as being very good looking. That shows their competence in terms of their fitness to rule. As R.R.R. Smith has noted, a fine, handsome, well-proportioned body and features meant an honest, noble, and brave character. The description of Augustus and Suetonius' biography can be unpacked with reference to the physiognomic guidebooks to indicate that he was energetic, bold, well endowed, great in soul, upright and brave, with characteristics of a lion, hence the goldenness, curly hair, the animal equivalent of perfect masculine leadership. Even being short was a sign of quickness. It was a good thing. Philo and Josephus share this consciousness in their descriptions of key persons from Scripture, and physiognomy was also used by the authors of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 4Q 186, 4Q 534-6, and 4Q 561. It was around. They could have used it. In the type of biography dealing with the philosopher or sage, the appearance of the subject is not ignored, and there was a veritable industry of busts of philosophers. However, with the rise of Stoicism, a natural realism was popular, and within a Roman context, the true virtus encompassed a rough, tough, serious and no-frills appearance. Thus, handsomeness is not a feature of a true philosopher. In fact, it could be an impediment. Apuleius, apparently, was accused of being a magician because of his handsome intended appearance. Apuleius defended himself by saying there were other handsome philosophers, notably Pythagoras, but in fact he wasn't handsome at all. He was dried out and pale, with twisted and tangled hair that was straw-like, stringy and knotted into clumps. He says in Apologia 4:1, the true mark of a philosopher then is to be so preoccupied with philosophy you never use a comb. In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Apostle Paul is clearly presented as a kind of wonder-working travelling philosopher, not unlike Apollonius of Tyana. It is said that Onesiphorus knew Paul not in flesh but only in spirit, in Acts of Paul and Thecla 2, but that does not stop the author giving a detailed description of Paul. He saw Paul coming, a small man in stature, bald-headed, bow-legged, well-proportioned, with eyebrows meeting, a little long-nosed, filled with grace. Sometimes he looked like a human being, sometimes he had the face of an angel. This image of Paul can be unpacked using the rules of ancient physiognomy to indicate Paul's positive attributes, as Malherbe has shown. The image is also remarkably consistent in representations of Paul in early Christian art, as we see in the 5th century portrayal of Paul in the cave of Paul and Thecla in Ephesus. And I think he is presented as quite short here because Theoclea is just a little bit taller than him, or almost the same size, so he's of woman's size in terms of the portrayal. How am I for time actually? Because I'm concerned.
Doing really well.
I'm doing really well. I'll slow down. I thought my clock is going slowly. This image of Paul can be unpacked using, I've said that. At around the same time as this work was composed, Irenaeus provides startling testimony to the existence of a portrait bust of Christ that could be honoured alongside the busts of the great philosophers. Writing against the Carpocratians, he states in Adversus Hereses 1:25-6, they also possess images, some of them painted and others formed from different kinds of material, while they maintain that a likeness of Christ was made by Pilate at that time when Jesus lived among them. They crown these images and set them up along with the images of the philosophers of the world, that is to say, with images of Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and the rest. They have also other modes of honouring these images after the same manner of the Gentiles. Unfortunately, Irenaeus does not say what these images looked like, but clearly the Carpocratians had a notion of how Jesus should be portrayed. Here Jesus seems to have been crowned as king of all philosophers, and thus he may then have been depicted as one. Such an image, especially one of a stone, can have a very long shelf life and perhaps may have been influential outside sectarian circles. So now we come to the question of the ugly Jesus. That there was a purported memory of what Jesus looked like in the late 2nd century is also attested in a source hostile to Christians. Around the year 177 CE, the philosopher Celsus went to town on how unprepossessing Jesus was in appearance in his extensive refutation of Christianity, a true discourse. He states, if a divine spirit was in a body, it must certainly have differed from other bodies in size or beauty or strength or voice or striking appearance or powers of persuasion, for it is impossible that a body which had something more divine than the rest should be no different from any other. Yet Jesus' body was no different from any other, but, as they say, was little and ugly and undistinguished. Origen responds by noting that Celsus must really be using Isaiah 53, 1-3. Who hath believed our report, as we know from the KJV, who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed, that he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, and so on. Origen was in fact using the Septuagint version, of course, and that reads slightly differently. We give a message as a child before him, as a root in a thirsty land. He has no eidos, no nice form, nor glory, and we saw him, and he had no nice form nor beauty, but his form was unhonoured and failing beside the sons of human beings. Origen then also, though, cites Psalm 45:2 as indicating Jesus might well have been handsome, since there it is written that the king is more beautiful than the sons of human beings. Surely should have been in one of the Gospels. And yet Celsus does not accept that either. Origen himself does not, in fact, think Jesus was ugly. Earlier in Contra Celsum, he had concluded quite the opposite, that Jesus' body was superior in Contra Celsum 1:32. Origen says that Celsus was basing his notions on scripture and yet not even citing it properly. However, there is actually no reason to suppose that Celsus was in fact using scripture here. It is Origen who cites Isaiah. Celsus himself states that he gained his information as they say, os fasci. Morton Smith suggested that this indicates Jews who sought to attack Christianity, but when Origen mentions what Jews actually said about Jesus, it is that he was a homeless wanderer who didn't care about his appearance. They say he's a vagabond, an outcast who roamed about with his body disgracefully unkempt in Contra Celsum 2:38. He's not exactly short and ugly. The expression "they say," furthermore, is usually used by Celsus to introduce an example of Christian thinking that is completely silly or wrong, whether orthodox or heterodox. In this case, it is the notion that a divine being could be ugly and short. The comment actually attaches itself to a previous discussion by Celsus of Christians who say that, since God is great and hard to perceive, he thrust his own spirit into a body like ours and sent him down here that we might be able to hear and learn from him. Contra Celsum 6:69. So Celsus got his idea of Jesus being ugly and short from Christians. The notion of an unprepossessing Jesus is indeed found within a Christian milieu just around the time Celsus wrote. According to Justin Martyr, First Apology 50, citing Isaiah 53, 1-3, this is because the condition of Jesus in the flesh is to be contrasted with Christ in glory, and it is intricately linked with his suffering. An ugly Jesus inevitably leads to a terrible outcome. So a handsome Jesus would not have led to the crucifixion. And this kind of idea is replicated time and time again in terms of the reception of Isaiah 53, 1-3. In Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Cyprian, Novatian, Lactantius, John Chrysostom, and all the way through to Augustus, it becomes a trope that is just continually echoed in early patristic writing. There are various theories to explain why Christians of the later 2nd century wished to stress that Jesus was nothing much to look at. It clearly formed part of a contrast between the earthly and the heavenly, the past and the future, the demeaned and the sublime, the first and the second advent. Callie Callon has interestingly argued that there may also be a more strategic aspect to this. For Clement, Christ chose for himself an unattractive body, so that no one, because of praise for his comely appearance and admiration for his beauty, would neglect to attend to his words. Clearly, if you're talking and you're too pretty, no one listens to what you're saying. Callon also argues that an ugly Jesus set him very much apart from other competing cults of the time. So we've got the cult of Hermes, and there's beautiful Hermes in the Louvre over on the right. The sun god, Apollo, middle, the Dionysus over there, this very louche god, and the cult, particularly the cult of the deified Antinous, who's bottom in the middle there, Hadrian's murdered boyfriend, who is invariably depicted as divinely gorgeous. But if there was some memory of Jesus actually being ugly, why is this also not recorded by the Gospel writers? The Gospel writers really home in on Isaiah 53 in order to explain what is going on in terms of Jesus' death. Quote after quote after quote after quote throughout the Gospels and also early the rest of the New Testament. So why not mention also those crucial verses 2 and 3 that talk about his appearance? Were the Gospel writers in a bind? If they mentioned an unprepossessing Jesus in line with Isaiah 53, 2-3, would that clash with the idea of a kingly, handsome ruler from the line of David? If they mentioned a handsome one, then how would that connect with Isaiah 53 and Jesus' terrible death? Might it have been better to avoid all mention of Jesus' appearance? So in another strand of 2nd century Christian thinking, evidenced in legends of the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, the physical form of Jesus is not only unstable post-resurrection, but pre. In the docetic Acts of John, Jesus appears to a certain Drusiana in the tomb in which she is brought back to life by the apostle, in the appearance of a youth, in section 87. But then John explains that when Jesus first called him and his brother James, the latter said, "John, this child on the shore who called to us, what does he want?" John replied, "What child?" James said, "The one who is beckoning to us." John told his brother he was not seeing straight and added, "Do you not see the man who stands there, fair and comely, of a cheerful countenance?" James did not, but suggested they go towards him anyway, and the mysterious figure helps them bring the ship up the beach. Afterwards, when we left the place, wishing to follow him again, he again appeared to me, bald-headed, but with a thick and flowing beard. But to James he appeared a youth whose beard was just starting. James and John get more and more perplexed by this, and then it goes on, "For I tried to see him as he was, and I never at any time saw his eyes closing, but only open." That's scary. "And sometimes he appeared to me as a small man and unattractive, and then again as one reaching to heaven," meaning tall. Here we do have mention of a small, unattractive Jesus, as if it is an option, but it is only one among many. Ultimately, the lesson is, unity has many faces, in 91. Nothing about Jesus' physicality is stable, and he can be experienced as soft to the touch or hard, or even solid at another time immaterial, and he does not leave footprints, in 93. In the Gospel of Thomas, also, there may be some instability in regard to how Jesus appeared, because in Logion 13, Jesus says, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I am like." Simon Peter replied, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew says, "You are like a wise philosopher." While Thomas says, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." We have here three perceptions of Jesus, providing three different mental images. And I actually wonder, even with this new discovery of the Catacomb of Thecla in Rome, in the central panel where you've got the Good Shepherd in the middle of the ceiling, and there are these representations of four faces on either side of the Good Shepherd, of the four corners of the panel. I mean, it's natural to consider them the four evangelists, which would be a very early depiction of the four evangelists, but I'm just suggesting there could be also some manner of seeing Jesus in these different forms, depending how we see the theology of this particular catacomb. Because also there you've got this young man, you've got a bald man with a beard, you've got a very old man, the white as snow, hair as white as snow kind of image, and then you've got a mature man there, which does correlate quite well with what we have in the Acts of John. That this docetic celestial substance that you have led to further considerations. Valentina suggested that Jesus did not actually digest food normally and thus defecate, according to Clement of Alexandria and Miscellanies in 3. It is, as Calon points out, precisely the idea of Jesus being made of some celestial substance that leads Tertullian to use Isaiah 53, 2-3 against the docetics. In his treatise on the flesh of Christ 9, Tertullian insists that Jesus is not made of a new kind of flesh miraculously obtained, and his body did not even reach to human beauty, to say nothing of heavenly glory. Jesus could not be handsome because anything slightly divine seeming could lead to a notion of him having the celestial body and provide no rationale for his fate. His ugly body, according to Tertullian, invited abuse. So what then could Christians use in terms of representations of Jesus in art? The image of the fleshly Jesus was imagined and depicted in the 2nd century by the Carpocratians in their portrait bust, and perhaps also by others, but its most easily dateable representation, as we've seen, is the Dura Europos house church. If we look elsewhere in the 3rd century for extant images that may be securely dated as pre-Constantinian, leaving aside portrayals of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, the images are strikingly similar, and the scenes chosen for representation form a very small repertoire in the incidents in the Gospels. The definitive pre-Constantinian frescoes of the Roman catacombs, as defined by Graydon Snyder, appear in only 3 areas: in the sacrament chapels of St. Calixtus in Rome. There's some images there, the woman at the well and a baptism scene there you see, and that's repeated. The baptism is repeated. Raising of Lazarus is also repeated. In the double chamber of the Lucina area, you have the baptism of Jesus, and in the Capella Graeca of the catacomb of Priscilla, you have the healing of the paralytic and the raising of Lazarus. These depictions are actually replicated really well in later 4th century images of the same scene. Let me just go forward. And you can see it a little bit more clearly, but Jesus is invariably presented as a young man, quite good looking, wearing a light coloured garment, a tunic and a mantle, and he's either has sandals on his feet or is just barefoot, and he's invariably carrying a wand, because he is a kind of magician, philosopher, and able to wield a wand, raising Lazarus from the dead. So in his scene of baptism, he's invariably very young and usually naked, invariably naked at the baptism scene. So in these other scenes where he's talking to the woman at the well, again, he's this young, attractive man. There's no indication of ugliness. He's well groomed. He's wearing normal clothing. He stands there very confidently. There's no indication of him being demeaned in any way. He's healing the woman with the issue of blood, gesturing. He's a strong, powerful, handsome man. And there's absolutely no indication that these artists had a clue about Isaiah 53 and the ugly Jesus tradition. They're totally on board with the idea that Jesus must be handsome. We see this even more, I think, in the sarcophagi. So there's the sarcophagus of Santa Maria Antigua, dated 270, and you get a very little Jesus being baptized over here. Very young Jesus and a very old John the Baptist with long hair and a beard. You get the strong, confident, handsome Jesus on the cover of John Dominic Crossan's book in this particular sarcophagus from the Museo Pio Cristiano. It's a motif there. It's largely about the Jonah cycle, the resurrection cycle, the allegorical cycle of Jonah, but then you just have this little motif in the corner. And again here, Jesus is at both ends of this sarcophagus. On the one side, healing Lazarus, dressed in very nice clothes, a big mantle, nicely decked out, big hands, strong Jesus, and also doing some kind of healing over there on the right-hand side. If Callan is right that some of the church fathers could stress Isaiah 53 in order to shake off any associations with cults of good-looking young gods, they seem to have been completely unsuccessful in regard to artists, because the images of the catacombs and the sarcophagi show a good-looking young god dressed in a perfectly seemly way, standing straight, doing powerful things, acting the part. There are no depictions of any form of humiliation in any of the So, finally, to what extent, regarding Jesus' physical appearance, is this then a memory, a reception, or simply an invention? How much is it just a case of doing what you can with an image when there is precious little to base your ideas on? Did Celsus, though, know something we don't by writing on Jesus as ugly and short? Or was he just exaggerating on the basis of what he heard Christians say when interpreting Isaiah 53? The Church Fathers concluded from the Septuagintal version that Jesus was not good looking, but Celsus has more. He was short, ugly, and indistinguished. Such specifics do not derive from a precise scriptural precedent in terms of their language, and Origen himself notes this anomaly, as if Celsus was wildly extrapolating. Celsus reports what Christians said in more detail than we have in any extant passages from the Church Fathers. The question is this just pure reception of Isaiah 53, or is it a memory passed on in Christian circles even after those who knew Jesus were long dead? Did Celsus know how the Carpocratians depicted Jesus? In fact, he did know Carpocratians. He knew of Marcellians who followed Marcellina and represented Christians as espousing Gnostic ideas of cosmology that Origen eschewed completely, discussed at length in Contra Celsum 6:24-59, just before the passage in which he describes Jesus as short and ugly. Carpocrates, of course, the father of the so-called Gnostic heresy, according to Eusebius, taught Marcellina, or she accompanied Marcellina, he accompanied Marcellina, and she came to Rome at around the years 157 to 68. So there were Carpocratians in Rome being taught by Marcellina just at the time that Celsus was aware of some idea about Jesus' appearance. In terms of their image of Jesus, I wonder if they presented Jesus in some way as Socrates, who is invariably presented as short and ugly. According to Irenaeus against heresies, the radically egalitarian and somewhat loose-living Carpocratians apparently saw Jesus as an ordinary man. Jesus was the son of Joseph, quote, and was like all other men, though superior to others because his soul, strong and pure, remembered what it had seen in the sphere of the ungenerated God. Or else, for a memory of the actual appearance of Jesus, might we wonder about the comments of Celsus' imaginary Jew, who supposed accurately to represent Jewish criticisms of Christians when he states that Jesus was a wandering vagabond and really far too scruffy by the standards of civilized society. Celsus himself could indicate Jesus wandered about most shamefully in the sight of all in Contra Celsum 6:10. Perhaps, though, anyone could deduce as much by such statements as foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Humanity has no place to lay his head. Thank you.